The Haunted Violin. The violin had been sitting in the dusty attic for years, untouched, forgotten. Until the day Elijah Thorne found it. Elijah was a struggling musician, desperate for inspiration. He had inherited his grandfather's ancient mansion, a decaying relic on the outskirts of town, where the winds howled like the cries of the damned. While exploring the attic, he discovered the violin in a black velvet-lined case. It was unlike any instrument he had ever seen. Its wood was deep, almost black, as if it had absorbed centuries of sorrow. A strange insignia was carved into the back, an eye surrounded by thorn-like symbols. As he picked it up, a chill ran through his veins, but he ignored it. He was a violinist, and this was an instrument, nothing more. Or so he thought. The first night. That night, as rain lashed against the windows and the house groaned under the weight of the storm, Elijah heard it. A sound, faint, weeping, yet impossibly beautiful, the unmistakable wail of a violin. He bolted upright in bed, heart hammering. Had he left the radio on? No, the sound was coming from the attic. Summoning his courage, he grabbed a candle and climbed the creaking stairs. The air was thick, damp, carrying the scent of old wood and something rotten. The attic door was slightly ajar, though he was certain he had closed it. The moment he stepped inside, the music stopped. The violin lay exactly where he had left it. A cold sweat prickled his skin. Maybe it was the wind, the house settling. He convinced himself of this and went back to bed. But the moment he closed his eyes, the violin began to play again. The melody of the dead. The following night, curiosity overpowered fear. Elijah decided to play the violin himself. As soon as the bow touched the strings, a chilling sensation spread through his fingers. The sound that emerged was unlike anything he had ever played. Deep, haunting, filled with something ancient. It was as if the violin was guiding him, forcing his hands into a melody he had never learned. Then he saw them. Reflected in the dusty mirror across the room, shadowy figures stood behind him. Their faces were twisted, mouths stretched wide in silent screams. Their eyes, empty, endless voids, stared at him. Elijah turned, but the room was empty. The candle flickered violently, nearly extinguished. His hands trembled as he set the violin down. He barely slept that night, the melody repeating in his mind. The curse unfolds. Days passed and the music never stopped. Every night the violin played itself. The sound grew louder, filling every corner of the mansion. Worse, Elijah began to hear whispers in between the notes. "Play it again. Let us hear. We are waiting." One evening, a friend, Clara, a fellow musician, visited. Elijah, desperate to prove he wasn't losing his mind, showed her the violin. The moment she touched it, she gasped and dropped it, clutching her hand. Her skin was ice cold, her fingertips pale as if frostbitten. "Elijah, where did you get this?" she asked, voice trembling. "In the attic. It belonged to my grandfather, I think." Her eyes widened in horror. No, Elijah, this violin is not your grandfather's. It belongs to them." She refused to say more, only urging him to get rid of it. But how could he? The violin had become an obsession. Every time he tried to stop playing, the house filled with a deafening silence, an unnatural, suffocating void that felt more terrifying than the music itself. And then the dreams began. The man with no face. Every night, Elijah dreamed of a figure standing in the attic. A tall man in tattered clothes, his back turned. Each time, Elijah tried to see his face, but the man never turned fully. Instead, he whispered, his voice like rustling leaves. "Finish the song. Complete what was left unfinished." One night, the man finally turned. He had no face. only smooth, featureless skin where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Elijah awoke screaming. The truth in the shadows. Determined to understand what he was dealing with, Elijah searched his grandfather's records. He found an old, brittle journal. Within its pages, he discovered the horrifying truth. His great-grandfather had not been a simple musician. He had been a conductor of dark rituals. The violin had been crafted from the wood of an ancient, cursed tree, a tree that had grown over a mass grave of people who had been buried alive as part of a ritual sacrifice. The melody the violin played was the final wail of the dying. The spirits were trapped within it, bound to the music, waiting for someone to finish their song. The final performance. Elijah realized there was only one way to end it. He had to finish the melody. That night, he took the violin, lit every candle in the house, and began to play. The air grew heavy. The walls groaned. Shadows slithered from every corner. The faceless man appeared, standing behind him in the mirror. Elijah's fingers bled as he played faster, the melody rising into a crescendo of agony and despair. The whispers turned to screams. The house trembled. The candles blew out one by one. Then, with the final note, silence. And then, laughter. The faceless man stepped forward. "You played it well. Now, take my place." Elijah felt something tear inside him. His breath hitched, his body convulsed. He collapsed. The violin fell from his hands. The strings snapped. The faceless man reached down and picked it up. And Elijah. He was now standing in the mirror, staring out in horror as the faceless man, now wearing his face, smiled and walked away. The violin sat in its case, waiting for the next musician. And in the dead of night, the melody began again.